Beyond the neon horizon lies a place where the past and the future finally meet in a burst of light and color. Join our journey into the unknown as we explore the stories of those who dared to cross the line. Click subscribe now and follow us toward the next big revelation. On my son's graduation day, I handed him an envelope with everything I had left. But instead of opening it, he stood up in front of everyone, raised his glass toward his mentor, and said the man beside him was the father he always wished he'd had. He shook Dr. Calloway's hand while I sat in the back row. But when my son finally opened that envelope 3 days later, his world came apart at the seams. $62,000. My son's voice had that particular flatness he'd been using with me lately, the kind that made everything I said sound slightly ridiculous before I'd finished saying it. He'd repeated the number back to me like it was a punchline he was still waiting to understand. I stood in the kitchen of his downtown Toronto condo, holding my coffee mug with both hands because the room felt colder than it should have for late September. The countertops were quartz, the appliances were matte black. Everything in Daniel's life had become deliberately expensive in a way that seemed less about comfort and more about distance. "That's what the reception alone is going to cost," he continued, not looking up from the spreadsheet open on his laptop. "And that's if we go with the second venue. Claire wants the Fairmont." "I know," I said. I'd been to the Fairmont once, for a work Christmas party in 1987. I remembered the chandeliers. Daniel was 39 years old, a partner at a litigation firm on Bay Street, and he was planning an engagement party that cost more than I'd earned in any single year of my working life. His fiancée Claire was lovely. I want to be clear about that. She'd always been warm to me, always made sure I had a seat at the table. But her family had a different definition of celebration, and somewhere in the past 4 years, my son had quietly adopted it as his own. I thought maybe 10,000, I offered, as a contribution. "I've been putting a bit aside since you told me about the engagement." I could hear how it sounded before I finished saying it. Daniel finally looked up. His expression wasn't cruel. That was almost worse. It was patient, the way you look at someone who means well but consistently misses the point. "Dad," he said carefully, "Claire's parents are contributing 40,000. Her uncle from Vancouver is flying in, and he's already offered to cover the catering. This is a different scale of event. I understand that. I just wanted to help." He closed the laptop, looked at me with something I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had and kept filing it somewhere I didn't have to examine. "You've always done your best," he said. "I know that. But some things are just outside your range." He said it gently. That was the version that stayed with me on the 401 driving home to Barrie. Not the words, the gentleness. Like he'd been practicing how to say it without it sounding like what it was. I'd worked 38 years for Ontario Hydro, starting on line crews in my 20s, eventually moving into field supervision, before the restructuring took most of my department in 2009. Margaret, my wife, had been a registered nurse at Royal Victoria until her knees gave out and she took early retirement at 57. We'd raised 2 boys in a 4-bedroom house on a street where everyone knew each other's cars. We hadn't been wealthy, but we hadn't been careless either. Daniel's younger brother Kevin lived in Halifax and called every Sunday. He'd become an electrician like my father, and when he got married 6 years ago, the reception was in my sister-in-law's backyard with a rented tent and a caterer from a local Portuguese place, and it was the best wedding I'd ever attended. Daniel had been Daniel's best man, and given a speech that made Margaret cry for 20 minutes straight. But that was before Bay Street, before Claire's family, and their Rosedale dinner parties. Before Daniel started correcting my grammar in front of company, I went to the bank the following Monday. Not because Daniel had asked me to, because I couldn't stand the alternative. The loan officer at TD was a young man named Prashant, who walked me through the numbers with professional kindness. Based on my pension and Margaret's retirement income, the maximum they could offer was $28,000 at 14.5% annually over 5 years. Monthly payments would be $657. I sat with that figure for a long moment. It would mean cutting back on the prescription plan I'd added after my cardiac event the previous winter. It would mean the roof repair went another year. I signed anyway. I called Daniel that evening and told him I'd secured $28,000. Combined with my original $10,000, I could contribute $38,000 to the celebration. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear the television in the background. "Dad," he said, "we've already finalized the budget with Claire's family. Everything's been allocated. Where was this 2 weeks ago?" I tried to get it sooner. Another pause. "Look, it's a generous gesture. But it would actually be more complicated to add funds at this point. It changes the accounting." He said accounting like it was a legitimate reason. I sat in Margaret's old reading chair, the one we'd kept in the corner of the living room even after she passed, because neither of us could figure out where else it should go. I looked at the approval letter in my hand, the number I'd agreed to pay back over the next 5 years, and I thought, I did this for nothing. Not nothing. I did it because I was afraid of what it meant if I didn't even try. The next morning I drove back to the bank and began the process of canceling the loan. Prashant looked at me with that professional neutrality that I suspected masked genuine concern. "There's a $400 administrative fee for early cancellation at this stage," he told me. "I know. Cancel it." The cancellation took less time than the application. I drove home on a bright October morning, the kind of light that made the highway look like it was made of hammered copper, and I felt something clarify inside me, the way a dirty window clarifies after rain. Not better, clearer. Over the following months, I watched myself disappear from my son's life, by degrees so gradual I might have missed them entirely, if I hadn't started paying attention. The engagement party came and went. I attended and stood near the gift table and shook hands with people whose names I forgot instantly. Claire's father gave a toast that brought the room to its feet. He talked about legacy, about what it meant to welcome a son into a family that understood excellence. Daniel stood with his arm around Claire and beamed in a way I hadn't seen since he was 12, and scored his first goal in midget hockey. I drove back to Barrie at 10:30. The 400 was quiet that time of night. The wedding planning consumed the following year. I received updates the way you receive updates about things happening in another country. Daniel would call on Sunday afternoons sometimes, and give me a brief itinerary of decisions that had already been made. The venue had been booked, a restored heritage property in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The photographer was someone whose work had been featured in Toronto Life. The rehearsal dinner would be Thursday evening. I was invited to that, yes, and to the ceremony itself, of course. He said, "Of course, the way you say it when the thing isn't obvious at all." I asked once about the father-daughter, father-son dance. "There's a parent dance," he said. "You'll be included." He moved on to something else before I could ask what included meant exactly. Margaret had been gone for 3 years by then. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, fast the way they'd warned us it might be. Daniel had been devastated. Both boys had. But grief had sent them in opposite directions. Kevin inward and then slowly back. Daniel outward and then further. He'd thrown himself into work with a dedication that looked, from the outside, exactly like success. I understood it. I didn't hold it against him. But I'd started to notice the way he described his childhood at dinner parties when I was present. The modest upbringing, the public school education, the sense that he'd built everything himself from very little. He wasn't wrong, exactly, but he was editing. He was turning our life into a story where he was the author and I was the setting. "Simple background," he'd said once, laughing at something Claire's father had said. "Dad was a hydro worker. Good man. Just, simple." I'd been standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of Niagara Riesling I didn't particularly want. The wedding invitation arrived in mid-March. Cream paper, letterpress printing, the kind of envelope that felt substantial in your hand. I opened it at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and read it twice. The ceremony time was listed as 2 o'clock. I put it aside and didn't think about it again until I mentioned it to Kevin on our Sunday call. He'd received his invitation the same week. His said 2 o'clock as well. But when Kevin talked to his cousin Michelle, who was one of Claire's bridesmaids, she mentioned the ceremony was actually starting at noon for immediate family. There was a private family portion before the main ceremony. Kevin hadn't been told about it either. He called me afterward, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice, the way he was trying to figure out how to tell me without making it worse than it was. I thanked him. I told him not to worry about it. I hung up and sat with what I now knew for long enough that the coffee went cold. There was a private family portion. For immediate family, his immediate family apparently had been reassigned. I started writing that night. not because I'd planned to. Because I sat down to watch the news and instead found myself at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and my reading glasses, writing the first sentence before I'd consciously decided to write anything at all. It took 4 evenings, the way anything honest takes longer than you expect. I wrote about Margaret. So about the morning she called me from the hospital to say the biopsy had come back and her voice had that specific steadiness she used when she was frightened. I wrote about driving Daniel to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 9 winters. I wrote about the summer. I worked a second job doing weekend electrical work for a contractor friend so we could afford Daniel's law school application fees, the ones he'd mentioned needing the night before the deadline. I wrote about the day he was born, August 14th, 1984, a Tuesday, the hottest week of that summer. I'd stood in the hallway of Royal Victoria and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my own father died. Happy crying, the kind that surprises you. I wrote what I needed him to know, in case he'd forgotten, in case he'd revised the story so many times the original had worn away. I sealed the letter inside an envelope. I set it beside the wedding invitation on the kitchen table and looked at the two of them for a while. Then I thought about what else to put inside. Not money. I was finished with offering money. Instead, I drove to Kevin's storage unit in Innisfil, where we'd been keeping a box of Margaret's things I hadn't been able to sort through. Inside was the small photo album she'd kept on her nightstand, the one with pictures from Daniel's entire childhood. His first day of school, gap-toothed and wearing a backpack that was almost as big as he was. His minor hockey team, the year they won the regional championship, and he'd cried on the ice. His university convocation, Margaret gripping my arm because she was so proud she could barely stand. And one other thing, a letter Margaret had written to each of the boys, not long after the diagnosis, in the months when she was still well enough to think clearly and write clearly and say what she needed to say. She'd given Kevin his at Christmas that year. She'd asked me to give Daniel his when the time felt right. I'd been waiting 3 years for the right time. I put Margaret's letter inside with mine. I put 3 photographs inside. I sealed it all together and wrote Daniel's name on the outside in my best handwriting, the careful printing I'd learned from my father, who'd learned it from his. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket and drove to Niagara-on-the-Lake on a Friday in June. The property was everything the photographs had promised. Old stone walls, manicured grounds, the kind of place where history felt deliberately maintained. I arrived at 1:40, 20 minutes before the 2 o'clock ceremony I'd been invited to. The parking lot was full. Guests moved across the lawn in summer linens and careful shoes. The air smelled like cut grass in the beginning of evening. A young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece was managing arrivals near the main entrance. I gave her my name, and she found it on her list and directed me to the East Garden for the main ceremony. I noticed she didn't ask if I was family. I found a seat in the 3rd row, which was the best available. The chairs were rented white wood, precisely spaced, with small floral arrangements tied to the end of each row. Everything was considered. I sat with my jacket on my lap and my envelope in the inside pocket and watched guests settle around me. An older couple sat beside me, Claire's aunt and uncle from Victoria, warm people who introduced themselves and asked how I knew the couple. "I'm Daniel's father," I said. The aunt's face did something complicated for just a moment. "Oh," she said, "how wonderful." The string quartet shifted from background music to something more intentional. The guests quieted. I looked toward the front, where a stone archway had been decorated with white roses, where a minister waited with a leather-bound book. And then the processional began, and there was Claire, radiant and real, on the arm of her father. And then from a side door I hadn't been watching, there was Daniel, walking slowly, looking at Claire the way I hadn't seen him look at anything since he was young enough to be completely in the present. Beside him, with a hand on his shoulder, was Dr. Calloway, his law school mentor, his senior partner, the man he'd described to me once as the most formative figure in his professional life. Dr. Calloway guided Daniel to the arch the way a father guides a son, placed his hand on Daniel's back, said something to him quietly that made Daniel laugh, and then straighten his shoulders, then stepped back to take his place in the front row, the seat on the groom's side reserved for immediate family. I watched from the 3rd row. The ceremony was 40 minutes. "It was beautiful, genuinely," Claire cried. Daniel cried. The minister said things about partnership and commitment, and the ordinary courage of choosing someone every day. Kevin sat 2 chairs to my right and reached over once and gripped my arm without saying anything. I put my hand over his and left it there. At the reception, held on the south lawn as the late afternoon light turned everything amber, I moved through the crowd with the careful self-containment I'd been practicing since October. I accepted a glass of wine. I spoke to people who asked me questions. I found Daniel and Claire and hugged them both and said the right things. Claire held my hands for a moment longer than necessary and looked at me with something in her eyes. I appreciated but couldn't quite read. Daniel said I looked well. I told him he looked happy. He did look happy. I meant it. At some point, Dr. Calloway found me near the perimeter of the lawn, where I'd moved to be slightly outside the main cluster of guests. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man whose handshake communicates that he expects you to be worth talking to. "You're Daniel's dad," he said. "I am. He's a fine lawyer," he said. "The best student I've had in 15 years. You should be proud." "I am," I said. "I've always been proud of him. That part was never the issue." Calloway looked at me steadily for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, became more careful. "For what it's worth," he said, "he talks about his parents, about his mother especially. He told me once that the reason he works as hard as he does is because he watched her work." He paused. "I thought you should know that." I thanked him and meant it. I held that piece of information like something fragile and real. The toasts came after dinner. Claire's father gave a generous, funny, polished speech about their family's happiness. Claire's maid of honor made everyone laugh and then cry in quick succession. Kevin stood and spoke about Daniel for 5 minutes in the plain, direct way Kevin did everything, and what he said was honest and loving, and drew the loudest applause of the evening, which surprised no one who knew Kevin. Then Daniel stood. He thanked Claire's family. He thanked the guests for traveling. He thanked the venue and the caterers and the photographer. He thanked Kevin, who raised his glass. He thanked Claire in a long, careful, clearly practiced way that made her cry again. And then he paused and said he wanted to thank someone who had shaped who he was more than any other person outside his marriage. I raised my eyes. He looked at Dr. Calloway. He said that the mentor relationship had become something he could only describe as the father-son dynamic he'd been missing since he'd truly become a man in the world. He said that Dr. Calloway had shown him what it meant to lead with integrity and be taken seriously. He said he was grateful beyond words. Dr. Calloway stood briefly and nodded, visibly moved. The room applauded. Daniel sat down. I set my wine glass on the table in front of me, with the careful steadiness of someone who has decided something without consciously deciding it. Kevin's hand found my arm again under the table. I didn't look at him. I looked at the candle in the center of the table, burning in a glass holder, very still. After the applause settled and the room returned to its private conversations, I stood. I straightened my jacket. I picked up the envelope from the inside pocket and walked to the gift table near the entrance of the tent, where wrapped presents and cards had been accumulating all evening. I set my envelope down among them, plain and white, my son's name in careful printing on the front. I said goodbye to the couple at the door. I found Kevin on the edge of the lawn and hugged him for longer than I usually did. He said, "Dad," and I said, "It's all right." And it was as close to the truth as I could get. I shook Dr. Calloway's hand on the way out. He held it for an extra moment and said it was a real pleasure. I believe he meant it. I drove north on the QEW with the windows down, the warm June air moving through the car, the radio off. The highway was quiet enough that I could hear the road under the tires, which was a sound I'd always found unexpectedly comforting, the pure fact of forward motion. I thought about what was in that envelope. My letter, which said everything I'd spent 4 evenings finding words for, Margaret's letter to Daniel, which she'd written 37 months ago in the sunroom of our house on a Thursday afternoon in October, and which said whatever she'd needed him to know, in her own words, in the handwriting that had written his name on birthday cards and school forms and Christmas tags for 30 years, and the photographs, including one I'd found at the back of the album, one I'd almost missed, taken in the hospital on the day he was born. Margaret in the bed, exhausted and radiant. Daniel, 8 hours old, wrapped in a white blanket. And me, sitting on the edge of the bed beside them, looking at this child like he was every good thing I'd ever expected from my life, arriving all at once. I wasn't in many photographs. I was usually the one holding the camera. I thought he should see that one. I got home to Barry just after 11. The house was quiet the way it had been quiet for 3 years, a specific quiet that still surprised me sometimes, the absence of another person's breathing in the rooms. I made tea and sat in Margaret's chair. At 6:47 the next morning, my phone rang. I was already awake. Dad. Daniel's voice had a quality I hadn't heard since the night Margaret's doctor called us into the consultation room and closed the door. "I'm here," I said. I read the letters. A pause. Both of them. "Good," I said. "Dad." His voice broke slightly on the word, came back steadier. "Mom's letter." He stopped. "I gave him the time." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" "Because I was waiting for you to need it." The answer surprised me as I said it, but I knew it was true. Another silence. Outside my window, the lake was flat and silver in the early light, the morning coming in soft off Georgian Bay. "Dad, I need you to know that I know what I did, what I've been doing." The gentleness in his voice was different now from the gentleness in the condo kitchen 18 months ago. That one had been practiced. This one was unguarded. "I'm sorry. I don't have a version of that that's good enough. But I'm sorry." "I know," I said. I don't know when I started thinking that being embarrassed by where I came from was the same as being proud of how far I'd gone. His voice was careful, choosing words the way he chose them in court, I imagined, when something real was at stake. "But I've known for a while that it wasn't right, what I said at the toast, how I've treated you, all of it. There was one thing I needed to say. I want you to understand something," I told him. "I was never asking you to choose between worlds. I was only ever asking you to remember which one made you." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was rough in a way that made him sound briefly like he was 12 years old and had just lost a hockey game and was trying not to show it. "Can I come to Barry this weekend?" "Yes," I said. "Come Saturday. I'll make the thing with the potatoes your mother used to make. I've been practicing, and I've almost got it." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, the unguarded kind. The kind I'd been waiting a long time to hear again. After we hung up, I sat for a while longer in Margaret's chair, watching the light change over the water. I thought about what she'd written in that letter, which I had not read, which was between her and her son, which was private and permanent and hers. I hoped it had said what he needed. I trusted it had. She always knew what needed saying. I thought about Dr. Calloway's words by the perimeter of the lawn. He talks about his parents. The reason he works as hard as he does is because he watched her work. All those years I'd thought I was invisible in the story he told about himself. Maybe I'd been there the whole time, in the part he didn't say out loud. I finished my tea. I got up and looked out the window at the bay. Still silver, still flat, the light beginning to find gold in it now. Then I went to the kitchen and found the recipe Margaret had written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside the pages of the cookbook I'd bought her in 1991 and never once opened. Her handwriting, small and clear, the instructions for the potato thing the boys had always wanted at Christmas. I read it through twice. Then I got out the cutting board. Saturday was 4 days away. I wanted to make sure I got it right.